Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Educated Colin Snap channel. We are going to be doing the meta tier list for the early July season. Let's begin. Dun, dun, dun. All right, so this tier list, I would say, I guess first thing I want to talk about is that there's going to be no numbered tier list. So, in the other tier list, right, they took a lot of time. That's because I was like making a tier list and numbering them and having to like move them back and forth, and it's like, why am I doing all this work for like? It's not getting more viewership. This extra work. So here we go. This is going to be covering most deck lists, most at least popular deck lists. Um, and there's just going to be no number of tiers. I will say that um, the like where they show up in the tier list is going to be a good representation of how strong they are, how powerful they are. The most popular decks, the most powerful decks are going to be near the top, and as we go down later on, these are going to be less popular, not necessarily less powerful, but just they haven't shown that these are consistent decks that you can use. They are all decent, maybe except for the last one, but generally these are all pretty playable. So don't. I didn't really like that people would look at the list and be like, "Oh, the ones at the bottom unplayable." That's really not the case. You can play almost anything. It's just that um, there are decks that are stronger, and there are decks that you will see more often over the course of a season or a session of playing. So those are the ones we're going to be looking at first, and et cetera, et cetera. Here's like the blueprint, right? The first list will be the standard list, the most common list. So this is the list you're going to be seeing generically that most people are playing if you see it. But then the second list, right, is more of like uh my suggestion. It's not they're not always better, but I would say like these are more adjusted, usually higher win rate decks. So they're the ones that I would be looking into myself, that kind of thing. And then sometimes the third section will either be notes, just general notes I put about the archetype, or sometimes I'll have a third list if I just think, oh, two lists isn't enough. I actually do. It ends up being in a lot of archetypes more than two lists because what I'm doing now is I'll have alternatives next to the cards that I think you could swap them out. Like, so for this example, right, we have the sunspot. You could easily place Spider Ham in that spot. So because of that, like, there will be decks that will have these alternatives. They're not always going to be better, but they're more like these are things you can change out if you need to. I always get questions, but I don't have Jeff, essentially. Is the question I get a lot. How do I replace what do I replace it with, right? That kind of thing. So I'm just trying to help those people. But it doesn't mean that you can't just play Sunspot. Like that's done generally fine. So those are some of the changes with this, but it should be a good overview. Let's begin. So first thing, of course, we're gonna have the evolved, the high evolution decks. Those are very popular, very prevalent. First one we have is evolved lockdown. So this one, you need to win the storm lane is something I wanted to talk about. And you still have some issues with Killmonger. So you need to win the storm lane because that lane really is the one that you put a lot of power in. A lot of times your Sunspot Nebula will be in that lane, and you'll have Storm into Cyclops in that lane as well, things like that. So those are where a lot of your resources end up going. So if you lose that lane, sometimes it could be a death sentence because it's going to be hard for you to win uh, both of the other two lanes a lot of the time. And then since you're running the Nebula, since you're running the Sunspot, sometimes the Killmonger can be something that can bite you in the butt if you're not playing around that. Sometimes the Doom helps you in terms of reinforcing that Storm lane, but it is something you have to be aware of. And you do have the DareDevil Control, and you do have Spider-Man, Professor X to just lock things down. So there's a lot of annoyance in this lane, in this deck list, and people can play Jeff as well. So that's also something you have to be aware of. But pretty strong, pretty powerful, pretty popular list. I mean, for good reason. It does a lot of work. Next up we have is Evolved Lockjaw. So this one is the other like most popular Lockjaw variant where you are running Lockjaw to kind of summon huge things, and then the prevalence of Hulk and Evolved Wasp just allows you to get a lot of value over and over and over. I will say Lockjaw is pretty key in this deck. You can sometimes mitigate it with Thor into Jane Foster into Hulk, and that's like sometimes good enough, but a lot of times you do need that Lockjaw to be your facilitator. And then Shang-Chi is a pretty common weakness that I you know the game needs, otherwise this deck would be absolutely disgusting. But yeah, you can always just lose a lane into a Shang-Chi, so just keep that in mind. But still very powerful, puts a lot of pressure out consistently, and is just a very, very strong deck. Next up we have Kitty Bound. So this is like one of the decks that can actually go pound to pound with a lot of the High Evolution decks, because you can just get so much power with a deck like this. So there's just a lot of moving pieces here where you can go Kitty and then bounce and Kitty and again into Ham, and there's just a lot of power here. This is definitely not that popular. I would say okay, it's very popular, but it's surprisingly less popular than I think it should be. Maybe that's a better way of saying it. So it always has really good stats, really really powerful stats, but it just seems like people like the straightforwardness of the high evolutionary decks a little bit more than the a lot of effort moving cards, playing tons of cards every turn that Kitty Bounce does require. You do have to care about priority a little bit, because Killmonger can mess you up, and people are running Shang-Chi, and Shadow King has been a nice tech into this deck as well that I've been really using and encouraging, I would say, as well. So there's definitely more answers to this than there used to be, but priority does matter a lot, which you can control pretty nicely with Beast, but sometimes you just don't have it, or it doesn't come out smoothly. So just keep that in mind. Next up, we have Destroy. So this is the classic Destroy with just Null and Death. There have been some adjustments with Phoenix Force to add that in and use that as another tool. But you do have to pay attention to your Null Death setup. That is usually your main win condition. Deadpool is sometimes the secondary one, but a lot of times it's not like as reliable as your Null and your Death. And then Venom is a very easy Shang-Chi target. A lot of times into this matchup, they'll turn 5 Venom, they'll have a huge Venom, right, setting up for their Null, setting up for their Death, and then you just Shang-Chi that lane and win anyway. So you got to be aware of that. Sometimes if you have a really good setup, right, you can do all that, and then Deadpool is like 12 power itself, and then it just wins you the lane as well. Or well, usually it'd be 16, right, unless you buffed it somehow with Nova later on. But 16 power itself, and it can win you the lane. But you just have to be careful of the Shang-Chi Venom. I see that people losing that a lot. Next up, we have Sera Control. So this one is just a more reserved, I guess, Kitty deck where you rely on Sera and messing with your opponent. So with this deck, really just has a ton of counter tools, right? You have the Killmonger, Enchantress, Shang-Chi, and you're just messing with your opponent over and over. So that's really how you win here. It's not really about having the most stats. It's about making sure your opponent doesn't have any stats. So pretty cool, pretty safe, powerful, and it can just destroy decks, right? Like people don't play around Enchantress that much anymore. So if you have the Enchantress and they're playing into a deck that can abuse it, right? You can just blow them out and get huge cube gains from that. Next up, we have Darkhawk. So Dark's a big favorite of mine, I would say. Sometimes people ask me what's my favorite deck, and I guess I do have to say like Darkhawk variant decks probably would be my favorite. I just like the flexibility of it all. I like the rocks. I like annoying people with them. The secret power of that, and Darkhawk's just a good card. Has some good locations as well. But when you're playing this type of Darkhawk Dino deck, their flexibility is really important. You have to make sure, oh, can I win with Dino? Can I win with Darkhawk? What are the cards giving me? What's Nick Fury giving me? Et cetera, et cetera. There's just a lot of moving pieces here to think about. Second list is like my personal Darkhawk deck right now that I made. and it's doing really well in the stats. I would say it's like one of the best Darkhawk decks to play, and I do have some gameplay with it, so definitely a cool um, deck if you want to look at it. I do have some recent videos you can take a look at. So pretty cool Darkhawk. Well, there's more Dino decks to be shown here, but this is a pretty cool variant. Next up we have Shuri. So Shuri's gotten back in the meta with the Red Skull buff. I would say that helped a lot, right? 28 power is pretty good. So um, the reliance of this deck does rely on Shuri a lot. Sometimes Soren, but Shuri is pretty core to win the game. If you don't have the Shuri, sometimes you just don't have the power to contest other meta decks. But with the Shuri, 28 power is definitely enough. So definitely a cool deck to run if you still like that deck. It's a little bit weaker because you don't have that double defense of Cosmo into an armor. Now you only have armor, so you lose a little bit of that easy defense of just always having some defensive tool here, but it's still pretty good. You do have to be careful about Shang-Chi. It's still a big weakness, and if you don't have armor to protect yourself, well, that's definitely something to keep in mind. Next up, we have Phoenix Move. So this is the new Season Pass card. It's not always a move deck, but Phoenix Move is like maybe the most popular that you're going to see. So it's relying on Human Torch and Multiple Man, sometimes Vulture, but using those to like generate huge powers and then going and copying it with Taskmaster is usually like the game plan there. I would say that it's cool and it definitely has some crazy like outputs in if you have like a perfect scenario, you can just destroy a person, right? But I will say like the Human Torch has some weakness in that it gets destroyed by Killmonger, so you have to be careful about that. But that's not always going to be the games you're playing, but it's just a scary scenario that can definitely happen. But overall, there is a lot of different ways to play this deck. It will probably get more refined with time. People are trying Shuri, people are trying Heimdall, people are not trying neither of those, and we'll see. But overall, it's a cool archetype if you bought the season pass, which a lot of people did. You can definitely try these out and see if you like it, if it fits your personal playstyle. And then next up, we have generic move. So this isn't using Phoenix at all. This one still struggles generally, even with the full pieces, but it does have some good ways to trick your opponent. And I would say like some of the best parts of move deck is the unpredictability of it all. Sometimes you'll have Heimdall, sometimes you won't. Sometimes you'll cloak on 5, cloak on earlier, and then you do have the Spider-Man 2099 to add some more destroy tools into the archetype. So there's definitely a lot going for it, and there's definitely more move decks here. I probably could have put a third list in this particular archetype, but I didn't, so whatever. But it's a fun deck, and there's definitely going to be some move fans that just love playing move, and it's definitely still viable. It's just like it's a move. Next up, we have pure high evolution. So this is a high evolution deck that focuses more on the pure high evolutionary factor. So it's not relying on a different archetype. So the other ones rely on Lockjaw, the other one relies on Professor X and Spider-Man, DareDevil Control. So this one is just more I'm a high evolutionary deck and I'm going to play high evolutionary cards. So you get the most high evolutionary cards in these type of decks. But they do get to use Abomination, and that's something some of the other high evolutionary decks don't really get to use, which is kind of unfortunate because it's a really good card. And there's definitely less Luke Cage, so you can get away with fully abusing, like fully jumping in and like making sure you get as many procs as possible. But it's one of the best reasons to play pure high evolutionary deck, the ability to just drop 9 power for free. You do have to be worried about Shang-Chi because it is 9 power, so sometimes that is something to be aware of, but you can protect your Hulk that way. And you do have to remember Hulk, right? So sometimes when people are playing this deck, they're just playing on curve, and they're like not even buffing their Hulk. But Hulk is the best reason to play high evolutionary at all. So you just have to be aware of like, oh, maybe I want to play a little bit slower so that my Hulk will be huge. So just keep in mind anytime you're playing these high evolutionary decks that Hulk is a core reason to play this deck. If you're just playing a 12 or a 14 power Hulk at the end of the game, it's like, what's the point, right? So just keep that in mind. There is a lot of ways to do that well, though. Here, right, we have the She-Hulk in the first list, and you have the Wave, which is really good in the second list. So there's definitely some tools there for those players. All right, next up we have Negative. So Negative's been an interesting list. I will say, like, I've played a decent amount of Negative recently, and it's felt okay. Like, even as like just a meta list to play in like Conquest or Ranked, right? There's just, because of Bass, you have the ability to win without Negative, and I think that's really important. Like, because if you do hit Negative, it's very strong. Like, you just have your chance of win go up dramatically. But with Bask into Iron Man, into Mystique, right? Like 3-power Iron, like 3-power Iron Man, 3-power Mystique copying Iron Man is actually very strong. So you just have this secondary win condition that allows you to be not screwed if you don't have the Iron Man, the Mr. Negative. So that's just that just helps the decks consistently a ton. And you just have to make sure that you are taking advantage of those high rolls where you get the negative. But overall, it's been a decent list, and I've seen more people playing it, so seems good. Next up, we have Thanos Death. So Thanos Death is just death build, but now you get to use the Thanos stones to destroy them, make your null better, make your death cheaper, and you just have more tools with Time Stone. Time Stone being very good in this deck. You can get null and then blow up the null with the Zola. That's just like really powerful in terms of like getting so many stats on the other lanes. And then people have been experimenting with Phoenix Force as well. Seems that's also working pretty good for them. So there's just a lot of flexibility when it comes to Thanos decks, and Thanos Death is no different. And then I also wanted to talk about some of the other Thanos lists here. So this isn't just like, this is just some of the all other meta deck lists, right? We have the first one, which is more of ongoing scenario. You have Professor X, you have Claw, you have Onslaught. Second list is more of like a control-y bounce tool. It's using a lot of the bounce pieces, but then you have more late game since you're playing Thanos. So that one's a pretty interesting list, I would say so myself. And the third one is more of like a Zoo-ish deck. It does run Ghost, and I probably should have made an alternative card for Ghost for sure. But there's definitely some things that you can play. Maybe just another 1-drop. Ghost is okay here. Like, Ghost isn't really played in a lot, but I will say, like, in Zoo decks, Ghost has a place because it's, if you're flooding all your ones in the last turn, they can't kill Wongreveal, right? You just play your Ghost early and then you can flood. So in Zoo decks, it's pretty cool. But generally, this one is a useful, cool little build if you like Ghosts and you have it and you want to play with it. It's definitely cool. You always, this I will say, like, Killmonger is a big problem in these lists because you need your stones. Your stones actually matter in these lists compared to the Thanos Death, where your stones, like, you blow them up yourself. you don't care. But here you do need your stones. They do proc a lot, right? Your Ant-Man procs, your Blue Marvel procs, your Onslaught procs, right? Like, your stone is pretty important. So Killmonger is a pretty big weakness into these non-death variant Thanos builds. Next up, we have Silver Surfer. So Silver Surfer, pretty cool list. I would say there's been some new tech recently where people are running Professor X and Spider-Man instead of Sera, which I think is pretty cool. It's a bit of a surprise factor. And since you can already buff those cards in the other lanes, then the Professor X doesn't feel too bad, right? Like, if you're playing Brood and then you Professor X the Brood or Spider-Man the Brood, well, you're buffing that lane anyway, so they just can't contest. So it seems like a pretty cool adaptation if you don't want to play Sera or you don't have Sera, right? That's something people were always complaining about with this deck. Oh, they have Surfer, but they don't have Sera. Well, people are doing new tech that doesn't require it. this deck is kind of a thinker deck because you are relying on Surfer and control tools. 3-drops have a ton of control tools like Killmonger, Juggernaut, Shadow King, Storm, Cosmo. Like your whole deck can be controlled to Polaris. So you do have to make sure you're thinking about where your control tools go and why you're using them. But has some good upsides. Very fun deck to play and pretty powerful in the middle when everything goes right. Next up, we have Nimrod Destroyer. I don't have Nimrod or Galactus, so they don't show up in when I screenshot it. But they are a pretty interesting way of using Nimrod. Shuri into Nimrod into Destroyer is really the main win condition, and then your other tools are just like secondary pieces. But it's pretty fun. I do have the second list, including Galactus, and I was thinking maybe I should just leave Galactus on its own, but generally there's not too much Nimrod. There's not too many different Nimrod builds, I would say. So I thought this was unique enough to add into the list. But yeah, I don't have these cards, so I don't have the most to say about it because I haven't played it myself. Next up, we have DareDevil Control. So this is just regular control builds usually. So you're just abusing Daredevil. Turn 5 Daredevil into Snap is just such a annoying thing to deal with. And these builds are more controlling in that you have to mess with your opponent. So Shang-Chi's important, Enchantress is important, and just like making sure your Gamora procs as well is pretty important. But these lists do work pretty well. They're pretty strong. You can always add Jeff if you want to add more power. I would say Jeff is better than Polaris for sure. So you can definitely do that. The second list is just I would say it's a build that you can find on Reddit. I believe it's pretty popular there, and it just relies on Orca to kind of be their win condition, which is pretty cool. If you go Hobgoblin into Orca, like your opponent can't contest that lane, right? And there's just other little things you can do, Warpath, Atuma, and you just have like Destroy. So like the Orca is like another Destroyer in a sense, right? The way it ends up playing, it's just a secondary Destroyer. So you're playing double Destroyer in a control deck. So seems to work, right? Try it if you like. Next up, we have Galactus. Yeah, I mean, it still works. it's still pretty good. I've been seeing some people playing weird and then just Galactusing like the final turn or the turn before. Like they'll be playing like random cards and then they'll play like a Psylocke on 4, like with like a random 2-drop that doesn't make any sense, and then boom, they play Galactus. You weren't thinking about it, and then you lose. So it's still a card that works. Still polarizing. I would say it did get a little bit weaker with the nerf. You do have to be on top of your toes, and it's harder to play it in Conquest because once people know they're Galactus, then their playstyle changes, right? So in ranked, right, you can still just blow people up, mess them up, get free wins, but it is harder to do Galactus things in Conquest, so you see it a lot less. But you can still do it. You can still be that player, and there's still ways to win in Conquest regardless. Like you have multiple tools. Usually, if you're playing in Conquest, you're going with the Nimrod secondary win condition as well, right? So it's not just Galactus or lose or anything like that. Discard. So discard has been hit pretty hard with Spider Ham. I would say there's a couple archetypes that got a lot weaker with Spider Ham's addition, and discard is definitely one of them. And that if you were playing the regular discard and they hit your Apocalypse, it's over for you now. So you're just done. So that's been a pretty rough go of things. But there are other ways. I would say the third list doesn't care as much um, about Spider Ham as maybe some of the other lists, but it still does care like a little bit, right? Losing your Apocalypse at any point and Hela can still hurt you. You just have like Infinite Magneto that doesn't care as much. So definitely still okay, but it does have that Spider Ham weakness that is just like glaring if you play into those matchups. Next up, we have Wongreveal. So this relies on Wong to just summon a ton of random stuff, either White Tiger or Doctor Doom. It did get a little bit hurt with the Doctor Doom nerf, but it still has other ways to win, so it's not that one-dimensional. But yeah, Cosmo can be a pretty scary matchup that can just wreck your game plan. So you have to be a little bit aware of that. I would say Cosmo's not as it's more popular than it used to be like 2 weeks ago, but it's still not that popular. So you can probably get away with it. There are just some matchups like Darkhawk does run Cosmo a decent amount, and Surfer runs Cosmo pretty heavily. So those matchups can be pretty bad, but it's a fun deck. It's pretty straightforward in that you play Wong and then you play onto the Wong lane. So, but it can work and it's pretty good when it does. Next up, we have Toxic Sera. So this is, I would say, way more prevalent before High Evolutionary came out, but there's still people running it. It also kind of like Junk. I'd say I don't have Junk in here, but the first list is very Junk heavy. I could have slashed Junk, but not all the lists are Junk. The first two are. The third one is just a little bit more interesting in that it runs Kitty and Kitty synergies on top of the junk engine. But this one just kind of annoys your followers in giving them trash that they don't want to play with, and then removing or making them a lot weaker at the end. So pretty cool list. A little bit less popular due to High Evolutionary coming on. People just running Luke Cage. Next up, we have Jeff Stature. So this is still a pretty decent deck, even with the nerfs, right? The Stature got a 1-hit power reduction, so did Black Bolt. So they lost 2 power overall, but that's not like the end of the world. It does matter, though. It does matter, but it's still a pretty decent deck, and there's definitely more move options with the addition of Ghost Spider. Now you have an extra tool if you don't have Jeff. Jeff used to be the only realistic game in town. Now there's more. So even if you don't have Jeff, you can still make this work. So still a pretty cool list. Still has the same play patterns. Electro Ramp. So this is Electro into Sandman and you win. Into some matchups that is actually true. Like you actually do win like that, but it's just a deck with lots of powerful late game. So you're just hoping that you play tons of late game and they can't deal with it. So it's pretty good, pretty straightforward. You are relying on Electro a lot of times. Sometimes Wave as well can be what you're relying on, but pretty good list and can be fun to play if you like that singular I do my one thing per turn playstyle. Cerebro 2, so Cerebro is always a popular list for some reason. People like making the numbers equal and buffing everything, right? So pretty cool list. You can lose to locations. So Luke Cage can be pretty necessary, as well as people running reduction, right? So the issue with Cerebro right now is that a lot of people have ways to manipulate your opponent's stats, right? Either with the High Evolutionary cards or just random Shuris that are running Red Skull. Even though Red Skull, like Luke Cage doesn't save you, you still get messed up with that. But overall, it's still pretty decent, and Cerebro is pretty necessary, so you have to be aware. But it's a fun list to play. The Cerebro lovers will always talk about it, so feel free to be those people. And then Cerebro 3, right? This one's overall more expensive, but has more tech options. And you're still running Luke Cage. It's just too core. I would say you can't really get rid of it, but you do get to run more tech. You get to run Shang-Chi, which is pretty cool. Valkyrie is also kind of pretty cool in that aspect. So there's definitely some benefits for playing this one. I would say Cerebro 2 is more popular. I don't know if it's necessarily better, but Cerebro 2 is definitely way more popular than Cerebro 3. So pick which one you like and see how it feels, I guess. Next up, we have Hela. All right, so Hela is always pretty polarizing in that some people just think it's not good, but some people really like the deck. I'm in the camp of I like the deck. I do also understand that There are going to be some games where you just don't get lucky or you don't hit what you need, and it's just going to feel bad, right? So there's some auto lose games with Hela, right? Where some decks, there are a decent amount of decks that don't have this auto lose property attached to them. You know, where you yourself discard your win condition, right? Like that's not something a lot of decks do. But it's still a pretty fun deck, and the high roll potential of it is extremely high. So you hit Hela and you win, or you discard Hela and you lose. So pretty nice deck if you like playing it. Feel free to do that and let me know. Next up, we have Collector Dinos. This is a Dino deck that's more reliant on Collector, less reliant on Darkhawk. You can play Darkhawk with it as well, but it's not the secondary engine that Collector is in these ones. So this one is definitely more reliant on summoning compared to the Darkhawk variants, where the Darkhawk variants you don't really care about what you summon a lot of times. This one you do care, and you most likely end up playing some of the cards you summon. Quinjet is way more important in this list compared to the Darkhawk variants here. So you just have to be reliant on the different end games that you are presented with and just making sure you're using them to the most efficiency. So pretty cool list and fun to play. Next up, we have Ongoing. This one is very free to play friendly. The first list you can play without a single Series 3 card, I believe, right? Yeah, and the second one you just requires one Series 3 card. So very free to play friendly. It does have issues with Enchantress, but Enchantress isn't super popular right now, and it is not the most common deck against like super high level players. Like you're not really seeing them play the only Spectrum 6-drop variant. Like you might see the Destroyer variant like later. Like that is actually something people still play, and I see sometimes. It's not super common, but I see it sometimes. But if you are free to play, a lot of times in these lists, there's not that much for you. So it's always nice to have a meta deck that free to play players can use well. So here you go. Here you go. Yeah. Next up, we have Lad Patriot. I would say like Patriot and Iron Lad. These are cards that have been hit by Spider Ham a decent bit. Iron Lad less so, but regular Patriot, which we'll talk about next, really did get nerfed by the Spider Ham addition to the game. Here with this one, you do need to calculate your lanes. It's pretty important to know exactly how much power you're going to get at the end of the game, right? You have a lot of different number adjusters in here with the Blue Marvel Onslaught, the Dazzler, the Patriot, blah, 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 blah. Right? So you have to make sure that you're winning a lane that you're contesting in. And the Invisible Woman just helps you into the Enchantress meta, right? Since you're running Onslaught, the Invisible Woman just like says, okay, you're not going to be able to hit my cards protected there. So that could be nice. Cosmo can still mess you up if you are playing Ultron into that, so you do have to be aware of that. But generally, you are pretty safe with the Invisible Woman. And then next up, we have regular Patriots. So this one, yeah, Spider Ham, I would say really hit this one hard because you are very reliant on Ultron and sometimes Onslaught, but Ultron especially. And you can definitely struggle without your Ultron. You can also struggle without the Patriot itself, right? Like it's a really core card, so you do have some ways to just falter. And then Killmonger can also just be a big annoyance, especially if you're running more than one series, one tier 1 card or one energy card, where the Killmonger can just blow them all up and you lose a lot of your value. So same thing with Ultron, right? If you go Ultron and they Killmonger, you could that could just be game over. So you do have to be careful about that, but it has fallen off the meta due to Spider Ham especially. And I believe last deck we have to showcase is Agatha, because people always love Agatha. If you want boosters, here you go. I would say like the third list in here is actually playable because you get rid of Agatha pretty quickly, right? You get rid of Agatha with Wave, with Lady Civ, with yeah, with those two, right? So if you can get both of them or one of them, right, you can get Agatha down on the board, or on the board or in the grave, and then revived with Ghost Rider. So that one might be more meta because you're actually playing the game. Whereas some of the other ones you're not really playing the game sometimes. So just some interesting lists if you like playing Agatha, either for the boosters or you just like the game playing itself. You can definitely try either the one and see how it goes. So overall, those are the 30 archetypes in there. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I wasn't like fully sure I would get this done, but I did. So let me know what you guys think about the new format. I like this one better in terms of how much extra work. I just really don't think the numbers, like the amount of extra work that required for like the payoff just didn't really seem it. So I hope you guys like this one. We'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And yep, I don't have a good ending for this one.
Educated calling snap. Once you watch him, you won't go back. He'll teach you to marvel snap. Your skills will be